today's lesson, lesson 3, is a little bit more about the Islamic world. So we're going to touch on a bunch of different topics. So first of all, trade. So of course we talked earlier about how merchants went all over the empire and did very well economically with trade. And as we've talked about previously, trade is the way that a lot of ideas are spread. So as the traders go throughout the empire, they're bringing the religion of Islam and, of course, the Arabic language. So because of that, the language of business became Arabic. And so that language spread throughout Asia and Africa. And another reason that they did well with trade was that the rulers would give the traders coins to use for buying and selling. So imagine, remember how it used to be bartering, and you'd have to bring a lot of, large, heavy, depending on what your goods are, with you to go sell. So if you can limit how, instead of bartering, you can just go and buy things with coin, right? Which coin in itself is valuable. That's going to make things a lot easier. The other thing that develops is very detailed record keeping, and that's going to start the new industry of banking, right? Keeping track. So it's interesting about in this culture, merchants are actually really respected because of their business skill and how successful they are in making money. Remember how we talked about in China how that wasn't valued? Well, in this society, it is valued, okay? All right, and then every time we talk about an empire, we talk about how it's set up. So the cities are very important, right, for trade. There we talked previously about some of the big ones, obviously Mecca, Baghdad and Cairo we talked about a little bit, and Damascus previously. So these are some of the major cities, and they're big because they're on trade routes, right? And the cities themselves, like traditional cities, tend to be pretty narrow and crowded. The main buildings in the city is the mosque and the palace, like in a lot of the different cultures, right? The palace and then whatever the religious building was. In this case, it's a mosque. So a mosque is a house of worship. I talked about it previously, right? That it's kind of like a church. It also served other functions like other religious buildings in the ancient days, right? So it was also in this society schools, court system, and centers of learning. So a lot of learnings going on in this culture. And as far as trade, the place where everyone went to trade, the marketplace, was called the bazaar. And so a bazaar, they have pictures on the side there of ancient times and even today. And it's like shopping stalls basically lined up, and they usually were covered in some way to try to get a little shade because, right, imagine where they're located, how hot it must have been, right? And so they're trying to make a little covered stall for shade. So that is usually this in town, a main part of the town, and then of course inns close by for travelers. But most people in this society don't live in the cities. They live in smaller villages outside, and they make their living with farming. Now, the majority of them don't own farms themselves. Some do, but most of the land, of course, is gobbled up and bought by wealthy landowners, and then the poorer people work for them, right? Just like we've talked about in the other societies, that the majority tend to work for the minority, and even some slave labor is happening also. They have quite a few because of all the conquering, and they have, remember how we've talked about how slaves are usually people who have been prisoners of war, right? And so they are going to be a lot of the labor force too. I'm not going to make you memorize all the different types of things that they grew, although it is interesting to note if you look at it, the lists, they are things that will grow in a place that has a hard climate, right? So they're going to really need to have irrigation for their crops is very important because they don't naturally have enough rainfall, and they're going to make sure they're planting things that will grow well in that climate, right? All right, so society, very similar to what we've talked about before, of course. The people in power are the government leaders, of course, the wealthy, the people who own a lot of either merchants or land, a lot of land, and they're going to have the power. And then, of course, it goes down from there, right? Artisans, farmers, workers, all like the common people are underneath there. And then at the very bottom, of course, would be the slaves who don't have any, I shouldn't say any rights. They have some rights, but they're have no power really, right? The rights that they did have, interestingly, under Islamic law, slaves do have some rights, which is nicer than what we had like here in America later, right? Mothers and children can't be separated. That was certainly not the case in America, right? And you can earn your freedom if you're able to get enough land. You could, enough money, you could buy yourself out of slavery, okay? Then they go into roles of men and women, very similar to what we've talked about before, right? Men are in charge of government and making money, making decisions, right? Business. Women are more staying at home and taking care of the families and the households, very similar to what we've talked about in other places. They are allowed to own property and, get some money in either like through trade or through they're allowed to inherit. So remember, we've talked about some places that women have almost no rights. So that is not the case here. They do have some rights. And if you're lucky enough, right, if you're upper class and have the advantages, you may even get some education. So that is possible. So, and then speaking of education, let's talk about what their contributions are. We've done this for every empire so far, right? So let's go through quickly. We talked a little previously about how they're very into education and a lot of exchanging of ideas. So here we have the House of Wisdom was in Baghdad, and the Caliph had started it, Mamun, and he had started it, and it was really interesting that people would come, and they're all different religions, right? Muslim, Jewish, Christians, and they are sharing ideas and doing research, and they are translating it into Arabic, all these ancient works, right? Greek and Persian and Indian. And so they're really learning from each other and open to different ideas, okay? And because they're translating it, they are doing very important work of preserving those ancient works. And so what's really cool about this is in this really long time period, right? They're saying like from 700s to 1400s. Over that long period of time, right, the Muslims have been working on converting everything to Arabic. And so the good news for that is, sadly, Europeans, because of all their warfare and fires and everything, have lost a lot of the original Greek writings. However, because the Muslims have been doing this hard work of translating everything, now in Spain especially, we had mentioned that before about how Spain is one of these centers of learning. They have these original ideas, but they're translated into Arabic now, and then they can be translated back into other languages. So they get translated into Latin, and so they end up getting back into the hands of Europeans, right? But in a kind of roundabout way. So that's kind of interesting. All right. Also, they, of course, are astronomers, right? And they are doing a lot of good science here. They are understanding the universe. They are correct about how eclipses work. They're describing that and how the moon affects tides. A lot of the star names we have today are because of these Muslim astronomers. The astrolabe here, there's a picture of, is a Greek invention actually, but Muslim astronomers used it instead of for a sailing tool. I think we talked about that a long time ago, right? How they use this for finding where they are while they're out at sea. But scientists now are using it instead to measure the distance around the Earth. And they were confirming that the Earth was round based on their mathematical measurements. So that's pretty cool. Muslims are also known to be the founders of chemistry because they experimented with metals so much. And Al-Razi is one of the famous ones. Not only was he, doing all these chemistry experiments, but he's the first one to label things as animal, vegetable, or a mineral. And I'm sure you've talked about that in science, that is a common labeling system that's still used today. So imagine how old that idea is and how that's a major contribution, right? You could feel proud. Mathematics also, the Muslims contributed a lot to mathematics. So you're going to notice that they mention this first one, we have Persians, and then they talk about Arab scholars. So they're trying to show you that they're all Muslims, right? They all believe in the Islamic religion. They have different cultural backgrounds, but came together, right, because of their common religion and this Arabic empire that kind of grows. And so they're just trying to show you their backgrounds, right? Okay, so let's see, where was I? So the Persian scholar, Al-Khazar, I always mess up his name, Al-Khwarizmi, I think it is. He was the inventor of algebra. We had talked about that a little bit before. He and another scholar, Al-Kindi, they remember how we talked about it with the Hindus, how they were the ones who first used the symbols 0 through 9. Do you remember that when we were studying India? Well, they took that idea of having those symbols and then they combined it into algebra, right? And so then, of course, because of their huge empire and trade and exchange of ideas, eventually it gets to the Europeans, and it's because of them, and so it kind of mistakenly becomes called Arabic numerals, but actually those numerals we know really were originally from the Hindi scholars, right? All right. Doctors, medicine. So let's see, a lot of different things. Arab doctors discover that blood circulates to and from the heart, and they are accurately diagnosing certain diseases, and they're writing them up in books for others to learn. Al-Razi is one of the famous ones who did this. Difference between smallpox and measles, right? Because, of course, we know they're different diseases, but they do seem a little similar if you're not educated on the differences. And they're publishing these books for other people to learn about. And there's another one here, the canon of medicine, and how the diseases are spread and different medicines, right? And how they work and what would work for what. So great information, and they're really knowledgeable. And part of the reason they're so knowledgeable is because they have requirements to become a doctor. Unlike most doctors at that time in other places, they had to pass a test so that they could be a doctor and practice medicine. And of course, they're going to go to medical school basically to learn these things. They have pharmacies, they have medical clinics, so really very advanced for their time. Okay. All right, and then literature. Like we always talk about what literature an empire gave us. This one, notice they mention Muslims wrote non-religious literature. What they mean by that is, in addition, of course, to all the Islamic, religious literature, there's also a non-religious, right? And so here we have one of the most famous works, The 1001 Nights. You may have heard it more as the Arabian Nights. Do you remember this, the Disney Aladdin, right, and all the stories of Aladdin, those are actually from this original work called The Thousand and One Nights is the real name. And then, of course, the other people called it, oh, what's that story? Oh, yeah, the Arabian Nights, right? Because they're from Arabia. So anyway, so that originated here. Also, there is an extremely famous poet who wrote a lot of people argue it's one of the best poems ever, the Rubaiyat. Omar Khayyam, who wrote that. And so that's another thing they're really famous for. So very accomplished in all the different kinds of science and writings. Okay. Then they mention here about historians, right? They often say that. Khaldun was the one who was talking about cause and effect relationships in history. And the thing he's most famous for, though, is mentioning that, right, when you study history, you have to really study the geography and the climate and how that it impacts what people do. And if you've noticed throughout our study, we've often been talking, right? Like every chapter starts with, oh, what's the geography like in that? What effect did that have on where people settled, right? And we talked about how, people settle around river valleys, right? And so we today, historians definitely do study history based around geography and climate and what that does to human movement. And so that's really amazing that he's the one who first thought to do it that way. All right, and then one of my favorite things is art and architecture. So Muslim art and architecture is gorgeous. Remember how we talked about how Muslims do not believe in idol worship? And I think I neglected to say this in one of my previous videos, but if you remember, I showed you when it was talking about Allah, I showed a graphic of the word Allah, not his picture. And I did that on purpose because you cannot find a picture of Allah because they don't believe in having a visual representation. It would kind of be like idol worship. And so that's why you will never ever find a Muslim person, right, drawing a picture or posting what he might have looked like, right? So anyway, since you're discouraged from doing that, their art actually doesn't really have human images or living creatures, animals and things at all. Instead, what they focused on is things in nature like flowers and leaves and stars and actually just a lot of writing and like script looking lines. It's really beautiful. So you'll notice that when you see the arts and the architecture. One of the most famous things about Muslim architecture is their mosques. And here's, actually they don't have a picture here, but I'll show one when I do it. The mosques are beautiful and there's a lot of famous ones throughout the world. And one of the things that you'll see in this picture, this isn't a mosque, but it still has it, the minarets. The minarets are these tall, thin towers on the sides of mosques. And remember I mentioned to you when we talked about praying 5 times a day, the person who calls people to prayer is called muezzin. So they, in the ancient days at least, used to go up in that tower and you can see they can call out from the top of the tower and it will echo right throughout. Nowadays, of course, we have things like radio and stuff. But anyway, so that's one of the common features in the beautiful mosques. Other buildings like palaces have really beautiful courtyards and porches and fountains and pools like you'll see in this particular picture of the Taj Mahal, right? There's a reflecting pool, right? And so that is just, it's not to swim in, it's about showing the reflection, right? And it's for beauty. So this is the Taj Mahal. It is in India, Agra, India. It was made by the Mughal ruler Shah Jahan, and he built it as a tomb for his wife, and he made it, of course, extra beautiful and everything as showing his love for her. It's marble and precious stones, and probably one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it's on my bucket list to go to see. There are some other famous palaces that you can go see, like Alhambra is one in Granada, Spain, which, if it seems weird to you that it's in Spain, remember how we talked about how the empire, went through all of, not all, but Southeast Asia and Africa, Northern Africa, and then up around Spain. And we talked about Spain so much because of the Center of Learning and everything, so it should kind of make sense to you. There's quite a bit of Arabic influence and Islamic architecture in Spain.